Hey, excited to be here today talking about lifecycle management. You know, oftentimes when we think about building modern cloud applications, we're thinking about how do I build the app and get it running in the cloud? And oftentimes that's only the, I'll call it the easy part, right? The other challenge, the other 80% is the full life cycle as we're thinking about building and maintaining that application over a long period of time. And so today that's what I want to talk about is what is lifecycle management and what are the concerns that we need to be thinking about and how does that play into application and infrastructure and security management? So with that, let's jump right in. So when I think about lifecycle management, I like to think about it almost through the course of sort of what are the sort of day zero, day one, day n things that need to be done, right? And so what do I mean by that? If I start and say, well, day zero, I'm building a new application, for example, and I want to, deploy that thing into the cloud or provision resources or write code for it, the first thing I need to do on day zero is I actually need to, create it, Whether I'm talking about creating the application or creating the underlying infrastructure, there's a creation problem that sits at the heart of day zero, right? And that gets me to day one. Now I've, created my thing, right? Almost invariably, right, unless we're doing something very simple or, it's really only meant to be used one time for an event or something like that, there's often a need to update it, right? And the updates could be driven by many different things. The updates could be because, great, we have a new feature we want to add, right? So this might take us to, day two, for example, right? So when we think about that transition from day one to day two, there's a lot of different things that could cause an update, right? Like it could be, like I said, a new feature, right? We're expanding something. It could be it was a bug fix, something is wrong. It could be we need to do some other form of, update or change. Maybe we need to scale up or down, right? There's a bunch of things that could happen that cause us to go and have to make an update. But fundamentally, that's how I think about the difference between day one and day two, is we're now past the initial creation. Now, of course, day two is really an ongoing thing, right? You can kind of think about this as sort of a perpetual process, because obviously I might have more updates, more fixes, more capabilities, etc. But eventually, over a long enough time horizon, you get to the final day, day n, terminal, right? And this is where you might be finally deleting it, right? So maybe it was an application that was only meant to be used for a certain period of time, or you've built a replacement for that application, or it's no longer needed, right? So I think by the time you get over here, it could be that you've end-of-lifed the particular thing. It's run its course. It could be that maybe this was actually only used in a development environment. So it was never meant to be a long-lived thing. I'm bringing it up, I'm doing some dev tests, and then I'm sort of tearing it down. And so this could be part of cleanup, right, of unused resources. And so there's a lot of things that kind of drive you through the sort of a life cycle, but fundamentally you can kind of see that we can think about a life cycle for a lot of different things, right? Now, if we kind of say, well, what are the concerns in each of these phases, you'll start to realize that they're slightly different, right? At day zero, I have nothing. I'm at the start, right? So what we have to deal with is nil. So I don't have a lot of concerns. My major concern is, how do I create this? And often, how quickly can I create this, right? So when I think about that concern from, day zero to day one, oftentimes it's really about enablement. How am I enabled to create this thing? And for me, how quickly can I go do that thing? I don't have anything, so however quickly I can get to day one, that's a win. Once I get past that, though, once I've done the initial creation, now I'm in sort of this day one, day two, all the way to day n land. My concerns actually start to evolve. They start to become a little bit different, which is I do have an existing thing. And so maybe I do have a bug I need to fix, or there's a security update I have to apply, or if something's not working, I have to scale it up. So you can start to see those set of concerns are actually somewhat different, right? You start to get into sort of these operational concerns that span the rest of this sort of a curve here, right? And oftentimes these fall into a number of different categories. One of them could be cost, right? For example, right? It's how much am I spending to run this application? Maybe I provisioned, an extra large database, or I'm running 50 copies of this application when I really only needed 5. Somewhere in, day 55, my boss emails me and says, why is this thing so expensive for us to run? It has 4 users, right? So there might be a cost concern that forces a set of updates as we optimize the architecture, right? At the same time, almost invariably, for most things, there's a set of risk concerns. And it comes up in different ways, right? It could be, hey, we discovered we're running a Rails application and there's a critical vulnerability that was discovered that allows someone to do a SQL injection. Okay, that's obviously bad. We don't want that type of a security vulnerability in our application. So that's a risk concern of how quickly can I update my application, day 50, day 100 after I've deployed this application to patch that now known vulnerability, right? Or, great, my app is doing really well, it's going gangbusters, users keep logging in, and I have a scale problem, right? So how quickly can I update it? So those form maybe, you can think about it as security risk, it could be operational risk because the thing might go down under load. There's different types of risk. But it kind of falls into these two categories, right, generally speaking, right? And then ultimately, even when you get to end of life and cleanup, that's a cost thing, right? I'm turning it off because no one's using it or it's end of life. Why should I pay for a thing that nobody's using, right? So it falls into, you can think about it as a cost concern, right? So we kind of think about this life cycle, right? Day zero, feels really good for a short period of time, right? And I think that's something that I always try and remind people is oftentimes as you think about designing any sort of a process, there's sometimes this natural tendency to focus on optimizing for this day zero experience. And that often makes sense if you think about, great, can I make my app teams, for example, more productive, right? Like that's obviously a thing everybody wants. But you don't want to do it at the cost of day one, day two, day n. And the reason for that is day zero lasts for one day, right? Once it's created, you're in this world, right? And this world lasts for, in some cases, there's applications that are still running decades after they were created. So you really want to think about from where I spend my time optimizing a life cycle and where are my calories spent in this. It's this part of the arc that tends to be high calorie, right? And so how do I optimize this? And I don't want to do it at the cost of sort of favoring this part of it, right? So this is a little bit abstract, right? When we talk about lifecycle management, obviously this is something that applies to lots of different things. Almost anything can, sort of be described as having a sort of a life cycle. So I want to make it a little bit more concrete, right? Let's talk about, for example, an application that we want to deliver, right? And what does that actually look like, right? The day zero of an application is relatively straightforward, right? I need to write the application, right? Hopefully test it and package it. But at some point I'd say, great, I've wrote that application, it's ready to go. I deploy it out into a production environment, right? And now it's running. Well, very quickly, I probably run into all of these things. My users maybe love it, and they're like, great, I have this additional feature I need you to add, or there's a bug fix. Can you fix this thing? It doesn't work with it, or like I said, I might want to scale up or down. So invariably, great, I deployed version 1 of my app, and now I have version 2, version 3, version n, until eventually you get to back to where you started, end of life, right? And so you can see an application very much follows a standard sort of a life cycle, right? And so again, I could get really, really good about how do I scaffold and get to the MVP part of my application. That's the day zero. But really, over time, what becomes the hard part is, hey, I'm doing an upgrade in production from version 1 to version 2. I have actual users. How do I make sure that this doesn't cause downtime, for example, right? Right? That's a great example of a thing. Well, you don't have that problem at day zero because you don't have an app. So what would downtime mean? Only once I get into sort of the later stages does this become an issue. Well, downtime you can think of as a form of operational risk, right? I don't want to create an outage that's operational risk for my customers. Maybe that actually hurts my revenue because it's this is a revenue generating product, so it might actually have implications out, to other things. So you can start to see how these things drive this day 1, day 2, and what I want to spend my time optimizing is how do I make it easy to deploy a new version and do it in a way that's high confidence, that has minimum downtime, that isn't going to be super expensive because I'm bringing up a full parallel infrastructure or something that's long running. So this becomes a classic example within the application line item, right? And same thing, this is where you'll start to get more sophisticated and about doing blue-green deploys, canary deploys, techniques like that. You might bring in more sophisticated monitoring tools to make sure you're monitoring different metrics and SLOs. And it's all in service of optimizing that arc, right, of how you manage the lifecycle of an application. You might think about the same thing for infrastructure, right? Oftentimes, day zero, great, I have a blank cloud account, there's nothing running in it. The first thing I need to do is, create my first set of, infrastructure. Maybe I'm creating a VM or a Kubernetes cluster. Maybe I'm defining a Lambda function. Doesn't really matter, right? So great, the first problem is I did a create, now I have some infrastructure. Invariably, much like my application, it needs to be updated at some point, right? I need to scale up my Kubernetes cluster. I need to change the version it's running. I redefine the Lambda with a new definition. I'm scaling up and down. all of these same things that might happen at the app layer also might happen at the infrastructure layer, right? The infrastructure layer also tends to have all of these same operational concerns, right? So maybe my update is not even related to my app. It might be, hey, there was an OpenSSL, vulnerability, and I have to patch the underlying, image that the application is running, whether it's a container or it's a VM image. So I might be patching. It might be, scale driven, right? But then oftentimes at this infrastructure layer, as we're sort of evolving, we also think about things like compliance, right? Great, maybe I'm scaling my app up and down. That's relatively simple. But what if I'm deploying new pieces of infrastructure and I need to be PCI compliant? And oops, I didn't think about the fact that these things are actually, within PCI scope, and I've, doing things that are outside of my policy. So as you start to think about this process, again, that sort of day 2, day 3, day N, it's really around how do I think about baking in as many of these controls around how am I managing my infrastructure costs as I'm scaling up. Maybe instead of going from 1 VM to 10 VMs, I go from 1 VM to 5 VMs. But it's also managing the risk of those other things. Did I introduce a security problem? Did I not patch things? Am I out of compliance? All the way until ultimately, hopefully, we're turning off that infrastructure when it's end of life, right? And I think oftentimes this ends up being a huge element of waste in modern infrastructure. It's because we see things that were meant to be dev test infrastructure, that were only meant to be used for a short period of time, that are still running months or years later, right? Versus properly thinking about a life cycle and saying, great, yeah, that dev environment is auto-destroyed after 30 days, right? So those are examples of sort of thinking about this life cycle up front versus great, yeah, it's usually easy to create, the mess. And it's hard to make sure someone's cleaning it up at the end of the day. And then same thing, right? So this might be a concern for developers. This might be a concern for operations. Our security teams have the same sort of challenge, right? So if you think about the security lifecycle, there's often a similar analogy, right? I might be writing an app and then deploying it on some infrastructure that's created, but my app needs to talk to a database. So great, the first thing I'm going to do is maybe create a secret. So I have a database, let's say username and password, that's allowing my application running on some infrastructure to talk to, let's say a database in this example. Well, that's great, but now this application's been running for a year and nobody's changed that username and password and all my developers have seen it. And by the way, we checked it into source code and someone pasted it into a Jira ticket. And so yeah, it's a secret, but that's not really super secret. It's in all sorts of different systems. So when we start to think about the life cycle management of this secret, okay, well, at some point, we should probably rotate it or update the secret, right? Because it's been exposed in all these different systems, we'd like to make sure that we change it periodically. So if someone finds whatever was in Jira or sees it, that it was pasted into the source code, it's not the same secret anymore, right? It's been rotated in the meantime. You can start to see how this creates dependencies. If I rotate at my database credential, that might actually require that I have to redeploy the application potentially for it to pick up that new secret. So these different life cycles are interacting with one another, right? So you can start to see how it becomes complex over time. Ultimately, same thing, right? At the end of life, when that application is no longer being used, we don't want to have a secret that exists for that database because that's just unnecessary risk, right? Someone might find that thing and use it to access the database and find user data in it, even if the application doesn't even exist, which needs that thing. So ideally, at the end of the life cycle of that credential, we're also destroying the underlying password, right? And so, this also has a full continuum of great, there's creation, there's update, there's deletion, and along the way, you probably have an inventory as well. So how do I discover credentials that are in my environment such that I'm making sure that they're managed, right? And same thing, with asset inventory, right? Do I have an actual inventory of my various infrastructure? And ideally, I have an inventory of all of my applications as well, right? So oftentimes there's a whole set of, I'll call it, things out there in the infrastructure estate that maybe aren't being managed or aren't being tracked because someone created it, we lost track of it, we weren't applying a proper lifecycle management. They're sort of orphaned, but they exist, right? You're paying for it, it's in your environment. You have secrets that were created, maybe no one's using them anymore, but they're still valid. You can still use them to log into a database if you were able to find them. So I think often there's both the cleanup act of discovering and inventorying these things such that you can apply a proper lifecycle management to it. And that can apply to almost any of these things, right? Applications that were created, that were abandoned, that are still running, but are sort of unmaintained, and haven't been patched or updated in a while. So that's the way I like to think about this. I think ultimately when you think about where people start, makes sense. It's day zero, so there's a sort of focus on how do we get this done really, really quickly. I think where people often sort of don't realize is over time, most of your calories, most of your time spent is in the day one to day end part of the curve. I think that's where it becomes important to optimize over time and ideally really have a consistent approach to how you're doing it across applications, across infrastructure, across different elements of your security estate. Because otherwise this becomes the really high sort of drag on the business, right? You do, I sort of joke, like I said, day zero feels really good for maybe the first 30, 60, 90 days, however long it takes to kind of get past that. But day one to day end can feel bad forever, right? And I think that's really the big difference. So I hope this video was useful and gives some food for thought as you think about how to apply lifecycle management to different parts of the estate.